The events that brought Rome to the brink of disaster had their origins in an act of betrayal 2 years earlier. At the beginning of the 5th century AD, the Roman Empire was under assault, its armies at breaking point. It battled hordes of outsiders, barbarians, as the Romans called them. These tribes, with names like the Huns and the Vandals, had swept all before them, even other barbarians. One such smaller tribe, the Goths, had been forced from their lands near the Black Sea. They had fled westward until they crossed into the Roman Empire. The Goths now wandered the empire, a refugee nation. Their leaders, Alaric and his brother-in-law Ataulf, were desperate to find a new homeland for their people, somewhere safe within Roman borders.
Hi everyone, nice to see you guys. Hope you enjoyed the clip on the barbarian invasion into Rome via Alaric, who was the leader of the Goths that came from the Black Sea. So this is the time in 410 when the barbarians came across from the east and from the north, and they were actually being chased by the Huns, who were a vicious tribe that were coming from the far east, and the Huns were moving west, and so as they were doing that, they were scouring up all the tribes in their way and pushing them across to the west as well, because they were such brutal men of warfare. And so the Goths, as you could see in that little clip, a lot of them, I mean, the whole families were coming across, not just warriors. It was families that were coming, and they were trying to find new land to live in, because they were kind of like refugees, like we have our refugees today, coming from all these places where there's such war going on. But at that time too, the Roman Empire had grown so much, and the military men were being stationed all over this huge empire, so they were kind of scattered all over the place at the time. So when the Visigoths, when the Goths came through with Alaric as the leader, there wasn't so many soldiers around, Roman soldiers, because they had been all stationed all around the Roman Empire. So it was kind of a good time, actually, to make one's way into the Roman Empire and to try and get hold of land and to settle there. So this caused a general migration of many tribes at that time, because of the Huns, and also the Mongols that were even further east were also pushing westward. So we find that there were many tribes. If you look at this map that I'm going to show you now, we see that there was the West Goths, there was the Huns pushing forward, there was the Vandals that were coming from the north. Possibly they were from the Scandinavian countries, even before the Vikings and that. And the Vandals were really vicious. So the Vandals were pushing south and eventually ended up in North Africa, and totally, destroyed these places of learning like Alexandria and Carthage. They totally vandalized the whole area of North Africa and caused much damage to the Christian world as a whole, destroying books and scrolls and a lot of historical records. So, the Romans labeled these people, these migrating tribes, and that's the barbarians. And the reason they called them barbarians was because these people were illiterate. According to the Roman mind, they were uncivilized. But if we look at it in a more realistic light, they were actually just men and women and families that were actually migrating because of need, as I was mentioning before. So how did the church actually meet with these people. You know, at that time, Rome, the emperors were sending the monastic missionaries out into the outermost parts of the Roman Empire. But here we see that now the peoples on the margins of the Roman Empire were now coming into the Roman Empire. So that meant that instead of them going out to meet them and them going out to convert, all these people were now coming to them. It's a little bit like our situation today with all the refugees that are actually coming into the West. How do we deal with that? Do we try and keep them out as much as possible, or do we accept what is happening with all this migration and learn how to adapt and how to reach these people with the gospel? So this is what was happening. The church was having to grapple now with this whole idea of reaching these unreached peoples. Now, at that same time, the Arians, who were believers that Christ was not actually God, their teaching had gone out into the far reaches of the Roman Empire, out even to these tribes that I was talking about. So a lot of them had been converted to Christianity, but to the Arian way of thinking about Jesus. And so the Goths that came to Rome at this time, they were actually Arians. So in other words, they had a knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. They had a knowledge of the Gospels, but they did not have the orthodox understanding of who the Lord Jesus was. So in their situation, they needed to be, to actually be convinced of the fact that Jesus was the Lord and Savior and Christ and God. And so the Goths were the first, the Visigoths were the ones that actually made Rome fall completely. It was in the year 410 that Rome actually fell. And as I was saying, the church now had this completely new mission field, how to reach these people. Before, the church had been reaching the Roman Empire, and the people that they were reaching was people that were civilized in a lot of ways. They could read, they could write, and so it was quite easy to actually get the gospel through. But now suddenly they had a whole new situation to deal with, where they had all these people that were their cultures and their traditions and everything was different. Their gods were different, and so they had to now try and reach these people. So how did they do this? This is a question, and we must be thankful that by that time they had a very strong leadership. They had the 5 patriarchal cities, and they had a strong leadership there, and so there was, the church was organized, which had lost a lot of its dynamic characteristics, but it was organized enough to experience warfare, the lands falling apart, and it was actually the church that stood strong, and the government fell apart and everything else, but the church was standing strong because of its strong organization at the time. And also through the episcopate, they had been able to stand strong. So eventually they had this wonderful strategy of how to reach these peoples. The first thing that they would do is the monastics would actually go out and they would actually approach the leaders of these barbarian tribes. And then from there they would offer their services. Okay, they would offer their services, and the services that the missionaries would be offering was the service of literacy, because at that time the monastics, that was their job. Their job was to rewrite and write books and so this was a wonderful thing. And the thing is that these missionaries as well, they didn't go in and try and convert or try and push their beliefs and everything onto these tribes. They actually went in to the leaders of the tribes and went in humbly culture to listen to their traditions, what they believed, and how they implemented their their laws and that type of thing. So they went in with a listening ear, instead of going in like a bull in a china shop and trying to convert. At that time too, eventually what was happening was that the gospel was being sent, as I said, by these culture bearers. But also what would happen is that the missionaries would go in with soldiers, with a whole army, and at the point of a sword, they would convert people and say, either you come to Christ or otherwise you're going to die today, type of thing. So there was that element as well. But mostly when they had success, it was because they went in with a listening ear, with a humble heart, and they would listen to what the tribal leaders are saying. And from there, they would offer their services by saying, we can codify, we can actually put this into writing for you. We can make documents for you, which you can keep as decrees for your tribe. So the leaders were quite grateful for this help that the missionaries, the monastic missionaries, were giving them. So at that time too, if there were tribes that were close to the big cities, it was the bishop who was the most influential magistrate of the city. And so it was the bishops that would send out these missionaries to do this job, to try and reach these tribal leaders. So this is how they operated most of the time. Now, when these tribal leaders eventually converted, because many of them would, because they were so grateful for the help, and the fact that they had been eventually accepted as part and parcel of the whole national fabric of society, because they would then convert to the Christian God, and many times they would renounce their idols and their gods, which were many. But the way that the leaders, the tribal leaders would deal with the situation was that they would then force the beliefs of Christianity onto their own people. And it was actually the tribal leaders at the point of a sword that would force and say to their people, you need to be baptized, you will be baptized, otherwise you will be rejected from our tribe. And so the people were actually forced to turn to the Lord, because it was a very shallow conversion. Most of the time, the majority of the people, they would come into the churches, and they would also have with them their pagan beliefs still. So how did the church deal with this? Because all these pagan beliefs were still entrenched in the hearts and the minds of these tribes and these people. Well, what they did was they towed the line, all right? And for example, they noticed that these tribes, many of them, especially the ones from the north, the Scandinavian tribes, they would see that they had their special feast days, okay? Their feast days, like, for example, the 21st of December was the time of the winter solstice, and it was the time when they would usher the sun, back into the world, and being sun worshippers as they were, this was a very, very important day. And so the church saw this, and what they did was they said, no, well, they worship the sun and that type of thing, but we can change this. We can change it from being the worship of the sun to the worship of the sun, S-U-N, to the worship of the S-O-N. Let us do that. Let us just change the ideas that they have. Just keep the feast, but just substitute the worship of gods that they have to the worship of Christ. And the birth of Christ was the birth of the Son, but at the same time it would be the birth of the Son of God. And so this is what they did with Christmas. And it kind of worked. It really did work. Although today there's a lot of people that don't celebrate Christmas because of the fact that it was pagan originally. That doesn't mean now that we can't celebrate the day of Christ's birth. So this is what the early missionaries did. And then also Easter, for example. Well, the word Easter comes from the word Ishtar, which was a was a goddess, okay? So actually we shouldn't really be using the word Easter. And so what we did is we just took over that feast day, and thankfully it was during the time when Christ was crucified anyway, during the time of Passover. So there was a lot of substitution that was taking place to try and accommodate for the pagans of the day. And so we see also that this is when images entered into the churches and all that, because these people couldn't read, and so the images and the pictures and the icons that were painted on the walls and all that were so that the people could actually get the gist of what Christianity was about, because of the fact that most of them were illiterate. So we see here, it says, like I was writing here, it says Christianity meshed itself with the tribal customs rather than superimposing or forcing itself on society. They went in and they listened. So now we see that this was wonderful. But at the same time, we see when we go a little bit north of the Roman Empire, we see, well, a little bit north, way north, right to the tips of the Roman Empire, which of course was Britain. And we see that at that time, because of the fact that all these tribes now were ransacking Rome, the Roman soldiers that were stationed in Britain were then called back to help the great city of Rome. And so that if we look at Britain, for example, we see that this place had already been converted, okay? Roman soldiers had taken the gospel very, very early in church history over into Britain, and had found fertile soil for the gospel in Britain. And it was the Celts. Now, the native people of Britain were the Celts, and the Celts received Christianity. When we think of the story of Saint Patrick in round about the time 400, when the barbarians were there. Well, Patrick, when he took the gospel over to Ireland, the Irish were Druids, so they weren't Christian, and Patrick took the gospel in the years kind of around about 400. He took the gospel over into Ireland, and of course many were converted to Christianity in Ireland, and Ireland became a very strong a place for monasteries and for monks who became great missionaries back into Europe and also into northern Britain, which was Scotland, and there in Scotland there was tribes that were very they were totally barbaric in many ways. So, but we see that the Celts had already become Christians, and they were there in Britain, but what happened was during the time of the barbarian migration and that type of thing, it was a few barbarians from the mainland hopped over into Britain, and they were the Angles and also the Saxons and the Jutes. And so these people came from, for example, the Jutes and the Angles came from Scandinavian countries, from the kind of round about those areas. So the Saxons came from the mainland, but they came over and they were pretty wild as well. And they came over into Britain and started to, to take over the territory. And by doing this, they actually started pushing all the Celts out of their homelands. So the Celts were being pushed further and further to the west, and found their way into Wales and went over the sea into Ireland, and that's where they started to settle again. So, but the Saxons and the Angles and the Jutes had no idea about Christianity at all. So they had once more brought paganism back into Britain and chased all the Christian Celts further and further west and into Ireland. So this was very early, and it was during the time that Patrick as well started to do his mission work in Ireland as well. So there was kind of an overlap of things that were going on. So it was during that time that Gregory the Great, he he was walking one day through the streets, and as he was walking through the streets, he saw a blonde man, with blue eyes, and who were these people? He saw a few of them. They had been taken as slaves, and the slave owner said, these are what's called angels, and according to tradition, Pope Gregory said, no, these aren't angels, these are angels. And from that moment on, he was totally obsessed with these people, finding out that they had come from Britain. In his heart, he said that he was going to go and reach these British people with the gospel when he found out that they weren't Christians, that they had never heard of Christianity at all. But, because of circumstances, he couldn't do it himself. So he sent out Augustine, who was a monk, and he was quite reluctant to go, but with a little band of followers, they did make their way up into Britain. And there they came to the tribes, and they presented to them the gospel message. And surprisingly enough, Augustine wasn't expecting it, but the people, the tribes, accepted Christianity with gratefulness. And so it was there that, of course, these missionaries started to listen to their traditions and that's where we get the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta were the laws and everything that had been put out by these tribes, and now it had been codified and put into writing. So we see that the church was very, very active during this time of the barbarian invasion. And it's fascinating to actually read, especially the British history, and to see how, for example, the Celtic Church. The Celtic Church in nature was quite different, actually, from the Roman Church. So we remember that the Celts had already accepted Christ a couple of hundred years ago with the coming of the Roman soldiers. And the Celts were very natural. Their religion based a lot on nature. So they kind of went with the rhythm of nature. They implemented, their rules and everything according to the rhythm of the seasons. Nature played a big part in Christianity because they saw that nature was a revelation of God. And they added Christ the Son, to this whole beautiful natural religion. And so it was not a rigid religion at all. It was based mainly in the monasteries. It wasn't based in civil governments. It wasn't based in churches and that. Their leader wasn't a bishop. Their leaders were abbots, okay? And from there they would go on these mission trips. And eventually Columba, he founded a monastery on the island of Iona, which became very famous, and it became a place of launching missionaries to Europe and that. And from Iona, which was a little island, it was from there that they sent the missionaries into this area, northern Britain, where it was quite dangerous, very hazardous for the missionaries. But because they loved Christ so much, they were willing to go. And so the gospel spread through the Celtic Christians from Northern Ireland. So we look at Southern Ireland, became Roman Catholic very early. The missionaries that came from Rome, they found their way into Southern Ireland, and it was there very early that the Southern Ireland became Roman. But even today, when we look at Ireland, we see that the north has a different brand of Christianity from the south of Ireland, which is very Roman, even now very Roman Catholic. We see Boniface, for example, later on in history, and he went to a Germanic tribe, and he bravely confronted this big oak tree that was supposed to represent their god Thor, and what Boniface did was he actually cut the tree down to show that actually he could do that, and this so-called god Thor wouldn't actually do anything about it, and he cut it down and he made it into a chapel. So I mean, these Christians from the north, from Britain and that, they were very brave, and they were coming into these Germanic areas and preaching the gospel. But sometimes the Romans would also come, the Roman missionaries would come into these areas as well, and you'd find that the Roman missionaries were much more organized. They would come in and they would build a church, okay? They would set up a council, a magistrate, and they would codify in the laws and everything, as I said before. But the Celtic missionaries would move on. They would move on to the next place. So they were more ambivalent. They were actually taking the gospel and they were allowing it to grow and develop within the soil of the culture and the traditions of the people. And then they would move on to the next place. So we see a different type of brand of Christianity coming out from the Celtic Christian world and the Roman Christian world, which even today has got an effect. Okay, so we see that we see Roman Christianity, which is very corporal, very organized, and then we see another brand of Christianity, which is more individual. It's more organic in its character. So I'm just going to leave you with this because I think I've spoken long enough, but I hope that you enjoyed what I've said and that you got something out of it. God bless you.